This week on Mutant Watch.
So hi everyone, we're here another week, and this week we have very special guest, Alisa Kwitney, who wrote the novel Untoughed that is gonna be out this next Tuesday. So it's like an exclusive interview about the novel that is gonna come out that we're all very excited about, and we recommend very much that you read it. But we're gonna convince you on the show. So aside from Alisa, we also have Gabriel who- and Travis and Nick with us. So first of all, the first thing we want to ask you, and I think I'm gonna go with this one, is why Rogue? Because I think this is a great question to introduce why you did write this character that a lot of us love a lot.
Sure. Okay, so Rogue has been on my bucket list of characters that I've wanted to write for a really long time. And when I first encountered Rogue, I was, I think, a college freshman. And what I felt about Rogue and Cyclops at the time was that Cyclops was the embodiment of male adolescent sexual anxiety. Oh my God, I have uncontrollable power shooting out of me and I can destroy you with it. And Rogue was the embodiment of female adolescent sexual anxiety, which was, if I touch you, I gain power and understanding of you and lose my sense of my own identity. So that I thought was fascinating. It made the source of her power also the source of her vulnerability. And yet she was funny and snarky and, had edge and attitude. So that combination just really spoke to me.
Well, we're only a few minutes in and my mind is already blown. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Really, that is a fantastic kind of insight into the whole process behind this novel, because you really touch on those character beats and that chemistry. And really from that approach, it makes a lot of sense, and kind of how you build out these characterizations and how they interact with one another. Can you tell us a little bit about how this book happened from behind the scenes and kind of what led to you taking on the project?
Sure. I was at San Diego Comic-Con, and I'm trying to remember, I guess it was the last one that was, before the world ended. And I was leaving, and just as I was about to leave for the airport, I ran into Stuart Moore, he and I were on staff together at Vertigo. And so I was hanging out with him a little, and I think do you have that thing like just at the moment where you need to grab a name, instead of the name that you're trying to grab, you grab the name of the three people you just met on a dog walk? I think it's Sven Larson, who's he's now, I think, the vice president of content of, what do you call it? I'm having a moment. It was just, so he was higher up at Marvel, and we started talking, and we ended up realizing we were on the same flight. And so he started to talk to me about projects, and was I interested in doing another prose novel for Marvel. I'd done the New Avengers Breakout a few years back. And it always seems to me that when I agree to do one of these prose novels, something really wacky happens. The last time I got kicked out of my house so a movie crew could take over. And I guess I thought, well, something wacky will happen, but it will be a movie crew. So little did I know that I would agree to do this, and the pandemic would happen. But yeah, so we talked about characters that I wanted to write, and Rogue was one of them. I think the other two that I mentioned were so obscure that everyone was like, "That's nice, Alisa." So I sort of shelved that for now. And Sven said that they were going to do these new great, focusing on the female superhero line with Aconite books. And so he put me in touch with Marcus Coyne and Charlotte Llewellyn. Wait, it's one of those British names I know. She's got a double-barreled name. I think of her as Lottie. She's been a fantastic editor for me. So anyway, we started to talk about the different characters, and as I said, should I admit like who these other characters are?
Yes.
Oh
please.
yeah, absolutely. We gotta know.
I am dying to know now.
We're waiting.
I really always wanted to do an updated version of Shanna the She-Devil. And because I was a huge fan of her in the 70s as a kid with, environmentalism and fighting people and the leopard skin bikini. It was just all things to me. I think as with Tarzan, her being white is now more problematic. So I think you'd have to do an interesting retake on the character. But I love the idea of the behavioralist who goes, into the jungle and goes kind of feral on all the poachers. And the other one was the cat, who later became Tigra. And I loved her as the cat. She was just it was sort of, if the Stepford wives had decided that instead of fighting back behind the scenes, they were going to become superheroes with specially designed claws, that's sort of what the cat was like before she became Tigra. I'm sorry, that's a really long digression from Rogue, but never mind.
It's so important to know too. Like we were this close to having those books.
But anyway, so we talked about Rogue, and as everything that happens with any large bureaucracy, you have an idea, you get really excited, you think it's about to happen, and then you wait. It's kind of like every slow burn sitcom romance where you're like, oh my God, this is it. This is the episode where no, it's not. Oh shoot, she went to Paris. We're gonna have to wait all through summer vacation for this. And so that's sort of how it was. And then of course it finally got approval just as the pandemic hit.
So we're also interested in how you got into reading the X-Men comics. How was your story of getting into these stories? Because that's something that we kind of always ask, because we're very curious about that.
Yeah. How did I get? So I was a comics reader as a kid. And this was back in the days when you could just encounter comics in your drugstore, in your local candy store, and there was a rack. And you would just pick the things that you liked out of the rack and whatever they had. So it was ancient times. And so with most people I knew, everyone started out with like Richie Rich and that sort of Casper the Friendly Ghost, and then graduated into Betty and Veronica, and some of the horror titles like House of Mystery, House of Secrets, some of the Red Circle books, and then also superhero. And then there came a point where usually first the girls fell off and then the guys fell off. And I didn't fall off for some reason. I just kept, and then when comic books disappeared, I was confused because I'm a very passive person. It didn't occur to me for a while. And I think somebody said to me, they're in comic book stores now. You need to go to a comic book store. So I was, like, okay, I'll go to a comic book store. And I remember that the first time a little kid looked at me and said, you're buying comics. Because at that point, I guess there weren't that many, whatever I was, older teenagers that were female buying comics. So how it was specifically with the X-Men. So I used to read whatever I could get my hands on. And I had sort of quasi cousins who were big comic book readers who have gone on to do a lot with film. And I liked their stuff, but I didn't fall in love. I didn't find anything that spoke to me the way some of the earlier discontinued feminist heroines had. And then in college, I went to the Printer's Devil. It was in Middletown, Connecticut, sorry. And I found the X-Men, and I thought, oh my God, it's a soap opera. It's a soap opera about all of these dysfunctional, neurotic, deliciously quirky people with these really oddball powers. And I should just say sideways that I had, I'm getting to the point where I don't remember all the titles, but whenever DC or Marvel would come out with one of these oddball books where someone would have really strange powers, or there'd be like a really strong woman who had a beautiful face, but her body looked like, some muscle-bound Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime. I was always very drawn to those books. And so the X-Men was the first superhero title that was weird. People had weird powers. People had deformities with their powers. And that just spoke to me on a very visceral level.
I really love that because so often of our guests and people who love X-Men were into the animated series, and a ton of our stories that we get of people who were introduced into the franchise were through that animated series or some other like medium that the X-Men found themselves onto. And we don't get a lot of stories of people kind of plucking X-Men comics off the racks and that just being their introduction into the franchise. I'd like to sort of follow up, if I can, real quick on what that looked like for you as a reader at the time, because I kind of got into comics through the digital age where a series was just there from 1 to, X amount until you were done with it, and you could just read linearly almost and when these books came out. But a lot of the release schedules at the time, it was kind of just whatever was available, right? Whatever was on the shelf is kind of what you were able to pick up. So how did that kind of influence your reading direction with the X-Men and how you discovered more into the franchise?
Oh, those are good questions, and questions I can answer. I'm always in terror that someone's going to ask me something where I'll hit some, incredible blank spot. And then later, like if I can call and ask people, to remind me, like, yeah, of course. So this is my memory. I was an English major, and for some reason, I think I was the only English major I knew who was doing outside reading. And my outside reading were comic books and romance novels. And the Printer's Devil was a secondhand bookstore that had comics, so it had both. And so I would stock up on whatever they had. And I think in a way I was looking for horror. Horror comics were my first love. They were my absolute love. So to be, honest, I think that must have been what I was looking for. And at that time, I think they didn't have anything. Maybe it was Elvira with the House of Mystery. And although I really liked Elvira, it wasn't quite as creepy as it had been. And at that time, strangely enough, I was also reading heavy metal with like a lot of queasiness, but I loved the art. And I was reading Vampirella. So that was sort of where I was looking. And so when I discovered the X-Men, I think that it hit enough of that. There were weird elements of horror and darkness, as well as humor and soap opera. And that was my jam. So as long as there were recognizable dynamics, it didn't bother me so much. I've never been a continuity person. As long as I could say, oh, there's this triangle here, or, I get it. Aurora is really upset about, whatever it was she was upset about through a whole big arc. And so I guess I was like a person with dementia in that the facts and the storylines would sometimes elude me. But as long as I could follow the strong beats of character emotion and the dynamics, I was set. And then somewhere in the 90s, I guess I started to try Alpha Flight and the New Mutants. And then I had the experience of being able to start something at the beginning and follow the storyline through. And I was just, so this was for a while before I was working at Vertigo, where I was just, buying up those comics. And it's funny, I have the comics I collected as a kid because my mom never threw them out. But the ones I myself collected in the 90s, or the late 80s, not early 90s, I don't have as many of those. I think I just let them go. I'm sad. Did that
So,
answer enough of the,
yeah.
the
Yes.
continuity? I'll
I
say one
think
thing about writing.
perfectly.
I think that writers often forget how important scenes are. If you have a really powerful scene, if you have, character growth that is slow enough but fast enough, and you've got really powerful scenes and moments of incredible power, that's what I think a lot of people are reading for. And so if I couldn't exactly follow, well, I think I missed a storyline back here, but they've caught me up kind of, I was okay with that. I do not know if things are more complicated now, because I've been now belatedly trying to catch up on Krakoa and a lot of the cool stuff that's been happening. I just went out and now I'm reading some of Mike Carey's earlier run and a bunch of other things. And I think if I could show you, I bought this with Mike Carey's run and this with, I'm sort of a little all over the place and I'm a little frightened. I feel like I've decided to learn, Norwegian, and I have no background. But maybe my brain was just more nimble then. I have no idea.
I do think that the X-Men has just gradually gotten more complicated as you go on. And I think that was kind of the point of the relaunch with Krakoa, is you don't need to worry about anything that happened before, just start fresh. But one thing that stuck out to me with your answer is that you said that you weren't too worried about continuity when you were reading. You were more focused on the dynamics, the scenes. And that is something that did stick out with me in the book, is it's not in the continuity that anyone who reads X-Men would recognize, but it does very much still have the same vibe, the same dynamics, the same personality, that it is so easy to just pick up and dive in. Because it still has that feel like you're reading a comic, but you don't need to worry about knowing anything from the comic because it's a fresh start. I think I was talking with Nick in chat earlier, and I was like, it feels like if the MCU had just relaunched, this is their launching of the X-Men with their fresh start. And that is the kind of feeling I was getting from it, which made it a very easy read.
Thank you. That is, okay, so that was my mission, because so when I write for myself if I were only a reader and not the writer. So I have to be very blunt with myself and say things like, okay, walking into a store, you haven't read an X-Men in X number of years, no pun intended. And, what is it that would make you feel all the deliciousness and delight, but none of the fear and trepidation? And I assume, so that's me writing for me, a comic book fan, a comic book lover, someone who's also enjoyed the movies, but a lot of life has happened and I can't remember exactly what happened in the comics or the movies. I only remember, how they say every world cuisine can kind of be boiled down to some key tastes, and it's a little reductionist, but Thai is, I don't know, lemongrass and basil, and I don't know, Ashkenazic Jewish is schmaltz, chicken fat, and I don't know, matzo ball, but that I'm obviously not, but there are sort of core flavors for each cuisine. And I felt that if I could get to the core flavors of Rogue and Gambit and some of the other characters, that would give satisfaction to both, somebody who's seen the movies and maybe some of the animated program and would like to read, but doesn't know exactly where to jump in. So that was what I was hoping for. And I didn't also want to alienate someone who has been following Rogue and have, because it's also the diehard comics reader who's going to read this, because, you all are insane and completionists, and you have more brain cells and more somehow an extra pocket of time in your day than anyone else has. You consume more content and keep it straight in your head.
I'm in love with that answer so much.
Absolutely. So I want to ask, talking about a little bit about Rogue, I want to ask you also about the kind of on the intention of the book. If you have anything that you, any real life issue, anything at hand that you kind of conflated with Rogue's powers or not, like this kind of mutant metaphor thing. Because I pick up some things mostly about sexuality, but I want to like get you to like, yeah, that.
Oh, you want me to admit it? It's not.
Yes.
Well, first of all, you have to see my shirt here, which I picked up at, I think, New York Comic Con, Being Social.
It's training.
It's so fitting.
I'm not an introvert. Just want to say I'm a writer who's not an introvert. But even though I am more of an extrovert, meaning when I'm having good interactions that are authentic with people, I'm energized rather than drained by that. But how many of those really wonderful interactions does one have? And I, especially when I was younger, I would have what I called social indigestion. You know, you're always trying to figure out as a young person how to perform yourself a bit because you're still feeling the, you know, how do I work this personality thing of mine? And, you know, sometimes I'm counterphobic. So whenever I got nervous about something, I would fling myself into it and then feel afterwards like, oh God, why did I reveal those things? Why did I say that much? And so I felt that some part of Rogue feels like social anxiety to me. And that feels very relatable. And I was quirky, like most kids who actually did a lot of reading of comic books. I was a quirky kid. You know, I was really happy and at home when I met my fellow nerds, but I, you know, when around normal kids, there were quotation marks if anyone's just listening to this, you know, I felt my strangeness. So that's that side of it. And then there is sexuality. So you know, when I've read YA, I've written some YA, I find that a lot of young adult prose didn't capture for me how much I felt like a crazy slave to my hormones, which is a little bit different than I think the way male adolescent sexuality has been depicted. Because, let's see if I can find a coherent way to say this. In the movie Crazy Stupid Love, felt very relatable, where there's this young boy who's sort of in the grip of both romantic and hormonal, you know, being captivated by this particular young girl, although she's older than him, so therefore inappropriate. And I felt like I was always falling in love and sort of losing sight of myself. And I'd been this really confident, quirky little kid. And then suddenly around age 13, I felt like I was constantly being swayed by other people, you know, and sometimes it would also be a platonic girl crush where I would just fall in love with a girl who seemed so confident and glamorous. And all I wanted to do was throw myself into that and become that person. And so I think Rogue for me captured social anxiety and sexual/romantic and just pure romantic takeover of the brain that happens. The other aspect of it for me was when I was 13, very briefly at an 8th grade dance, people said that I was a good dancer, and I was thrilled because this was my new identity. I was a good dancer. And then I went to summer camp, and there was a girl there who was a better dancer than me. And as I started to watch her dance, not only wasn't I as good as she was, but I lost the ability to dance myself because I watched her and forgot how my body moved. It was, you know, I don't know if you guys have the level of awkwardness that I had, but Rogue felt like such an amazing vehicle for all of these neurotic, but I think probably more widespread than anyone cares to admit issues.
I like that, and like you were
That
saying, and it's very much the book is a journey of Rogue finding her identity outside of those relational identities. Like she talks a lot in the beginning about who she is in relation to her aunt or her mom or the town, as opposed to who she is in relation to herself.
Mm.
And I can now that you bring it up, I can definitely see that comparison, and I think that identity struggle versus who I am to everyone around me is something that I hope every teenager goes through. Otherwise, I'm just with you in the awkward boat there. So one of the two.
yeah, I just felt like that the answer completely satisfied me.
Yeah, I think the other thing though about Rogue that I really loved is that there were all of these female characters that seemed more well adjusted. I kind of thought of it as Wendy syndrome, where the guys would be quirky and neurotic and snarky and cynical or whatever they were, and the women were, either clever waifs or, sort of earth mother altogether, or they would just turn into complete power mad bitches. And those were your three choices. Rogue was none of those things. She was more nuanced and more fun to write. It's I love to write characters who have a sense of humor.
There's definitely a sense of humor there in the relationship that starts to happen with Remy or Gambit, and that is ultimately kind of what kept me hooked in the story was what was going on with that chemistry, and it kind of helped to flesh out a lot of the other things happening. And going back to what you said at the start of the show of these characters sort of representing, coming into a boy or a girl's sexuality in adolescence, and that expression, what are some of the character beats that you felt needed to happen to lay that groundwork for these characters, and then how it needed to evolve as they got together and interacted more?
What are the character beats? Well, to some extent, they're the character beats of romance and to some extent of romantic comedy, which is second nature to me. I love having the structure of romantic comedy and romance. There's usually about 7 beats to a classic one, and then I love to play with them enough that you don't detect them as that, structure, because it's genre requires 2 things at once. Genre says, here are the beats, here are the tropes that you really want to execute, but you need to execute them so that it doesn't look like you're just fulfilling a required beat. You have to make it so fluid and natural that you don't see it, as a required move. I think of it as, the very best figure skating in the Olympics. You know that, here's where the double axel has to come, and here is where, but you have to fit it into the choreography with the music so that it feels like, oh, this is just, a moment where you're so wildly excited that you're going to do that big spinny thing with your head so close to the floor. So there's a lot. I mean, in the end, this isn't a pure on genre romance, because these two are going to have a much longer arc. And because, the end of a romance is that 2 people are partnered for good. And we know that Rogue and Gambit have a lot of growing to do. I created a new timeline in which Rogue and Gambit come together much earlier than they do in any of the comics continuities. In my defense, I think it's plausible. I think if you look at where Gambit was and what was going on in his life and where Rogue was, then there's no reason they couldn't. They were so close.
Yeah.
And so it didn't feel like I was doing anything wildly manipulative to get them together. But okay, so if they're going to meet this early and that they're going to have this long journey, that it's not going to be a romance that's just going to, she's 19 when this book begins, and this is not going to be the end of her character evolution, of her growth. But using those romantic comedy beats, and playing with them so that you can experience their courtship and the spark between them. That was part of the challenge. But I'll just say, for example, a lot of times people will hear, okay, so a romance has to have a meet cute. And meet cute is really not the right word for it. There has to be a moment in the meeting where you recognize that these two people have issues with each other. It may be positive, it may be negative, it may be both, but you're going to feel that it's not just a throwaway meeting. And that doesn't mean that it's the very first second that they meet that is the meeting. And so if Remy walks into the diner and that is their first actual meeting, but that's not the moment where they have their sort of romantic comedy. Well, it's not very comic, where they have their meeting, which should I spoiler a little bit?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So Remy has been doing some gambling with some of the bad good old boys that were Rogue's classmates, and she's leaving work and they are beating him up. And as for how that happens, there's a bit of an explanation there too. But Rogue has to figure out what to do because they are really beating him badly. So it's not cute, but it's certainly a meeting that will impress itself on both their memories. By the way, one of the things that I did have to change, I always tend to go a little too far in every which way. And there were a whole bunch of things, I think, in that scene too, where Marvel was like, pull back a little. So
now I want to know what had to be pulled back a little. Like,
I had the bad guys being nastier to Rogue originally.
oh, I see. Okay, because reading that, I sort of felt like this is a fun twist on the damsel in distress story that you get in a lot of superheroes, where there's a love interest happening, there's some romanticism happening, big tough man superhero saves damsel in distress, and this is something that Remy's like getting his ass beat, and I really loved how you kind of inserted Rogue into that situation and cleared things up in a way that felt unexpected, but also true to these characters. So could have gone a little farther. I think it would have helped that scene. I would have liked to see more out of that.
Yeah, there were a few places where I either went darker or a little more baughty than was on brand. Because I think at one point I just had Rogue saying some. I remember Kate to say, anyway, I have a body sense of humor, and there were a couple of places where they were like, pull it back.
I in that scene, I can definitely see the seeds of where that would have gone darker. That right before Rogue had her big moment, it was definitely starting to lead to that darker place. And I think that there was enough of the seeds left that I could see where it was headed, and the scene felt. It felt very empowering for Rogue to be able to fight back in that way.
Oh, good, because I think that it's important as a writer not to edit yourself too much. Sometimes if you know that you're working for a certain company or in a certain way, you can begin to preemptively edit yourself. And I don't think that you should always be taking risks as a writer. Stunned silence.
I'm going through the book thinking, there are some definite risks that happened, and maybe it's a good time to talk about a lot of the other characters that were involved. That was something that surprised me reading into it, because it starts out like it's pretty confined to Rogue's story, and then we get a little bit of Gambit. I'm like, okay, I can get into this, like a romance happening, but it really does start to encompass a lot of the X-Men franchise and a corner of X-Men that we don't get to see a lot of. And I know Duna's going to have a ton of questions about some of these characters, so I'm segueing into a discussion for Duna here. I'm being coy about it, but what was some of that like with your decision to include a lot of these other characters that are mutants in the novel?
Well, Okay, so two things here. First of all, I hated myself. There were periods I was writing this, as I said, during the pandemic under some really not ideal circumstances. So I mean, everyone had a different pandemic situation, and if my pandemic situation had been, I'm all alone with just my book to keep me company, that would have been fine. That was not my situation at all. All of a sudden, I lost all of my writing routine and most of my solitude for a while. So that made writing ensemble stuff really challenging. And, at one point, I think I was reading Raymond Chandler, rereading The Big Sleep, and there's some quote he had from a letter that said, I can't write a scene with more than 3 people in it. And I was thinking, I never again want to write a scene with more than 3 people in it. It was so, finally I remembered how I do things. Like, you have to sometimes draw it out and sort of figure out those 3 people are here and these are over there doing that, and try and, just keep track of everybody and what they're doing and how much time has elapsed. But, oh, good Lord, it's just, I remember that with Breakout as well. Let's see how I can, okay, so then originally, so when you're working for Marvel, they really like to know what you're going to do. They're not just like, you're a great writer, go for it. They really want you to come up with a fairly detailed outline. Now, there are people who are pantsers and they just write as they go. And there are people who are plotters and they have very detailed outlines, and I'm somewhere in between. So usually I've got an outline and then I've got the book. And as the book evolves, the outline evolves. Because of the pandemic craziness, I forgot, oh no, this is Marvel. I can't just evolve in different directions. So what happened is, I'm trying to think of a way to do this in non.
We can go a little spoilers. We're 30 minutes in. We can spoil a little.
There was a character, should I say who this character is, who was going to be the big bad?
Yeah.
Should I say who it is?
We're about 40 minutes in. This could be the warning to anyone who's wants to avoid spoilers. This is where you depart our podcast and come back after you read the book.
If you want no spoilers. So there was going to be a character who was going to be my big bad, and he was the pig. And as far as I could see, he had no other name. So I thought, this is fun. I can do a lot. I wanted a character where not a lot had been established so I could really play around. But as I began to write the pig as a person, I began to realize that I was getting into some uncomfortable waters for me. And that is, he was the only character who was visibly different and not human at that point. And I thought, well, if he's the only character who's visibly not human, that's a really different thing. That's kind of akin to being someone with a visible disability or deformity, as opposed to someone, who can walk around and not have anyone comment on their appearance. And so how am I playing with that? And so I thought, one of the interesting thing about the mutants is that there are always some who are visibly more different and others who could just look like humans. And I thought I need to deliberately have more of both. And I guess this is going to be a little bit of a spoil. I won't spoil all of it, but then okay, I'm going to be really specific here. So there was a picture, I'm trying to remember the artist of the pig, and I was looking at the panel, and this is sort of how I work. So I looked at that and I thought, okay, I am this character now. Who am I? How am I if I'm in this body? And I realized that the way he'd been drawn, he couldn't support himself without hand crutches. You know what I mean? He was so top heavy. And I just thought, if I'm in that body, I do some acting, so I'm like, I would need a hand. And I thought, oh, that's kind of like, then he's the only character who has a disability whom I've written. And I was talking with Al Davison, who's an amazing comic book artist and writer, about, is it enough to just leave out, and so he doesn't need to have, hand crutches. And I thought about it. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, when something's uncomfortable or you feel like you're beginning to work into a metaphor that isn't the right metaphor, don't just like shove stuff under the rug, you know, embrace it, turn it around, figure out how to make this the right metaphor. And so I realized I needed to bring in another big bad in a different way. And I needed to have this really inclusive cast to have part of the, you know, the stuff that always appealed to me about the X-Men and the other mutant titles. Am I still making sense?
Oh yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Yes.
So,
Totally.
so the part I forgot was to say to anybody that this is what I was doing. So I was so happy. As I got to the end, I'm like, oh, this is fun. No one's going to see this coming. And I think you can feel that through all the, you know, big battle stuff, I was definitely having fun. And then I handed the book in, and my editor said, you know, Alisa, you know, even when people have departed just slightly from the outline, Marvel's had some issues, and you've brought in a major character that you didn't even mention in your outline. Oh, yeah, that's a
Oops.
thing. And I'm also really late because pandemic. So we thought about it, and we decided that we would start by, I don't know, probably I shouldn't reveal all this, but screw it, I'm revealing it. So I wrote a letter. I don't suggest that anyone try this at home, but I wrote a letter saying, you know, like, dear principal, I would like to explain why I broke this rule. And Marvel was great. And they were actually, once I explained my thinking, and I love an obscure character, so I think it was obscure enough. So so I got permission to do that. And now that I've answered in this incredibly convoluted way, I can't even remember what your initial question was. But I think it was like, why did I choose these odd band of mutant cohort?
I love that answer because it really
Yes.
does give a lot of insight into the process with Marvel and sort of what we expect as readers too, with Marvel being so watchful over these properties and what happens to them. And what surprised me most was really the ensemble cast being so expansive and touching on a lot of different areas in the X-Men franchise, and also the spin-off potential of a lot of things that can happen. But I know Duna and Gabrielle both have follow-up, so I'm going to pass it on to them. There's some characters I'm sure they're interested in talking about.
Oh, and
Okay.
by the way, I'm just sort of curious as a writer later on if you'll tell me just, you know, what spin-offs as a reader you would most like to see.
Ooh.
My spin-off is very specific to how the book ended.
Yeah, so don't tell
yeah.
here because
But what I am also, what I'm trying to think of the best way to word this that's as least spoily as possible. There is a character which, unless my X-Men knowledge is failing me, that you created specifically for this book.
yes.
And I wanted to know more about the process on creating her. And I think, not a spoiler, say her name Tessa, because it definitely feels like it's related to what you were saying earlier about the need for representation, particularly with disability.
Yes. So, I mean, I think I can just say that Tessa is a wheelchair user, although that's not the most interesting fact about her. It's not meant to be. But it just sort of went like this. Whenever I could find an obscure Marvel character, you know, especially who'd been part of the X-Men or part of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, then I would use that character. Because I think there is great fun as a reader for me in saying, oh wait, I dimly remember this character from the early 90s or whatever someone's equivalent is. But I certainly didn't feel like I couldn't create my own character if I couldn't find the right character to slot in. And I think of it as in terms of dynamics. So initially I didn't know how much time I would spend in that section. And I thought it was going to be a shorter amount of time there and then a greater amount of time in a different place. And when I realized, oh, wait, this is complex, I need to stay here, I wanted Rogue to have a female ally. And so that was the first thing, sort of a friend and ally. I think that was the first important thing. And someone who is a foil in the sense that she has strengths that Rogue doesn't have, and and she will help contrast and compare these two characters, because that's what's fun with friends who are foils. And then I wanted to come up with a cool power. And along the way I was thinking about the fact that since I'd already begun to think about not creating a metaphor where how can I put this, being it's important with the mutants to recognize that at all times you're dealing with the thing itself, and also with a lot of metaphor. The mutants have always been a metaphor for minority rights of various kinds. And so it's important, and this is, I think, something that is always a little tricky about fantasy. You can accidentally find yourself stuck with a metaphor that you didn't intend, but that says, oh, look, on this planet you've created, everyone who's got a third eye is a bad person. And when you think, well, obviously nobody has a third eye in our world, but what by extension are you saying about people who look different? And so I didn't want to just do no harm. I wanted to actively do some good. And I thought about the fact that Professor X can't be the only wheelchair user. And I think the other thing that's sort of interesting that I've learned through the course of my life is, most of us are born into certain minorities or not. You're born Jewish or Asian or African American, and that is an identity you'll keep. But other minorities are we may not be a member initially, but then something can happen and you suddenly find yourself a member of people who have a disability or who need to use a wheelchair. And so I guess I just thought that was another way of trying to make this not real universe that I'm playing in resemble a little bit more the universe that we all actually do live in. But it was really important to me that the fact that Tessa uses a wheelchair is just not the point of her. It's just one of the things. She's a blonde. She's got this particular power. She's clever. She's also kind of snarky. She looks really wholesome and sweet and whole, like a sort of Dutch milkmaid look. And then she's not that in her personality. And I wanted all those things to be about who she was.
I love that. It was probably one of my most memorable lines in the book, and I'll try not to spoil too much, but there's a line that says maybe you didn't view her as broken for being a wheelchair user, and it really sticks out, and it's something that I always kind of associate with that book, and being able to handle a topic and the metaphor like you were talking, not with ease but with powerful sentiment, and it really lands and hits home with that particular ending and how you approached it. So great work. Now, I know we need to talk about a specific Brotherhood without spoiling too much. Duna, do you want to kind of take the lead on that one?
Yeah, I'm curious because the book is pretty open-ended, as we say, without making spoilers. And I'm curious on how it was for you to write that Brotherhood and some of the most iconic characters, and I'm talking about Lucrecia, of course. and how was that for you? If you would like to maybe continue that story, especially because some of these characters appear in a way that is not very central to the book, but the relationships they have between each other are pretty central to the character. It's like you saw a part of everything that is behind, because there's a lot behind. So yeah.
Yes, Lucretia. How to talk about Lucretia. So I'm going to talk about this in the most sideways way possible. My father was a science fiction writer, Robert Sheckley, who has his own following, and I got to know him through his books, actually, before I got to know him, because he didn't raise me. He was off in Spain. And I worked my way through all the science fiction books. And then I found the Stephen Dane books, were his James Bond books. And he had gotten into a situation where he was really bored of writing Stephen Dane. And yet he still had more books contracted. And so he wrote a book in which Stephen Dane is in such deep disguise, such a deep cover, that even we, the reader, don't know which character is Stephen Dane. And we get to meet all these different characters and think, ooh, which one is Stephen Dane? And it was my favorite of his Stephen Dane books, and it was his favorite. And I always thought it would be really fun to write a character who's, in deep cover for most of the book. So there's the fun of revealing who they are, but you've got to find a persona that is, first of all, in and of itself, so much fun to write. And then there was a line in my father's book that was sort of, someone said something about, I liked you better as, whoever the assumed persona was. And the Stephen Dane says, I liked me better too. And I think that there's an idea that someone might reveal more of themselves in disguise, that there's something true about the disguise. I also have a theme in a lot of my stories that we are often more honest and reveal more of ourselves when we are really concealed. So I like the idea that, I have a friend who actually makes these elaborate masks, and they're gorgeous kind of works of art masks, but she has said to me, you can always see the mask maker through the mask. You can see the shape of the mask maker's face, because they start with their face and then they move outward from there. And so those were all of the things that went into writing Lucretia, who was so much fun for me to write. And yeah, it's also, she's a good foil for Rogue, because Rogue has to figure out how not to lose herself, and this character is very comfortable losing themselves and not losing themselves.
Can I say that I got who this was in the first line? Like when you introduced the name, I knew it. Like literally the first line is said. Like even if it was a description, like the first line, I was like, okay, that's it. I didn't even have to like look who was accompanying them, which is like very much give it in a way. But nah, I didn't need that even.
I think that's more about you, Duna, and the kind of reading that you do. I wasn't too far behind you, but I definitely did not get it on the first line. And I gotta say that even knowing about the secret of Lucretia, I loved reading her even more. She is such a fun character to read, and particularly with the underlying themes of Rogue and her power and sexuality, just how bawdy Lucretia was, and just like in your face, it was so fun.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, of course she was even bawdier before. It was just like off-brand.
I want an uncensored version.
Just more boob jokes.
Yes. Uncensored cut.
But I'm glad, and Duna, I never want to watch a movie with you, because I'm scared about figuring things out. Were you one of those people in WandaVision where you just started watching and you're like, nailed it?
Yeah, I still haven't watched it. I'm really bad at catching up with that stuff, but yeah, I would probably have been if I liked the character enough. I think it's because I know Lucretia a lot.
Yes, and I'm. By the way, I'm reading Tom King's Vision series now, belatedly. I nearly read them last year before WandaVision, and I got distracted because I'm kind of ADD about my reading. But
we have an X chat that we have behind the Comic Watch, and I always call him the X Hive Mind with Duna and Travis and Gabrielle and a few others, because I totally did not catch Lucretia pretty early on. It's pretty embarrassing how far into it I was like, oh no, okay, now I get what's going on. Glad I didn't read it with Duna. That probably would have been spoiled really quick. But I kind of want to touch on, I know we're closing in on an hour here, with somebody who's picking up Rogue Untouched. Maybe they've read a ton of X-Men comics, maybe they've only watched some movies, maybe this is kind of their first introduction to the property. What would you want them to take out of this book?
I think that it is easier to read these stories than you might think. I think that sometimes what a lot of the movies and the comics these days might, there's so much spectacle and there's so much sweeping big stories that it can feel a little intimidating. And for me, one of the things I loved about WandaVision is I came in, I've seen every single Marvel movie, I think, well, just about, but I can't remember always. And people are like, well, as you remember, there was this crumb in, 5 years ago. I'm like, good Lord, guys, there's been, take in a lot of content, and unless I've refreshed and heard the analysis, I'm not going to remember that. And when I started watching WandaVision, for me, it was so much fun because I didn't need to remember a ton of stuff. I didn't need to go, and I wasn't like grabbing for these little moments in preparation for some huge battle scene. Everything felt very human scaled and very deeply personal. And that's sort of what I wanted. I wanted a story where you thought, oh, I can read this superhero story just the way I would read any other book that caught my interest. There's nothing I need to know. I do not need to, brush up on Krakoan or anything, in order to read it, and then read more.
I think that's perfect. I mean, really, it's such a good introduction to all of this and such a good primer to get you wanting more. And hopefully we get more. I would love a follow-up, just Rogue sequel for this.
Yeah, I'm torn right now. I'm writing a mini series, sort of a humorous time travel mini series for Ahoy Comics.
Oh.
And then I've got a bunch of different book ideas. I'm sort of not sure in what order I'm going to tackle the projects. I at the beginning of the pandemic, I was also feeling so drawn back to horror, which I hadn't been reading horror in a long time. And then suddenly I found myself really needing to read a lot of the novels from Paperbacks from Hell. And I think like The Nest with the cockroach horror. So I found myself thinking about horror in a way I hadn't in a while. And I got to use some of those elements. You can see some of it in Rogue because I love, having an unlimited special effects budget when you're writing a prose novel. I got to, do whatever I wanted. But anyway, wait, can I ask, before we end, there's some flashing lights with this cool display behind you. I just need to know what that is. Yes.
Those are comic boxes on a shelf, and they have neons on them for display.
Oh my God, I'm utterly hypnotized by the beauty of it.
It's usually better when it's not during the day. Our podcasts are usually at night, so it's darker in here and the lights light up better, but
I would have been completely incoherent if it were dark and that were pulsating like that. I finally would have been left with nothing but, a little light of drool coming down my mouth.
That's for when nobody has any questions and we're all just kind of looking around at each other. There's something going on.
Yeah, I had to get my Rogue and Gambit. Wait,
yes.
There we go.
Yay.
And, yes, that was meant to be visual interest, but my setup is not.
So one thing I wanted to ask you is like, if you could write Rogue in Krakoa, would you like that? Because I feel like one thing that the thing that mostly like arrived to me of this book is how her relationship to mutation and power changes through the book. That was great to me. How she starts like in this kind of way, and not spoiling anything, but it changes. And in the books, in the comics, her relationship has also changed a lot before she entered Krakoa and in Krakoa too. So I'm curious if you would like to write that, because it's a very, very different story right now.
It is. I'm sorry. Someone just knocked on my door and my dog is going nuts. Let me just make sure it's plugged in for this. The joys of being at home. Yes. So I am right now, I hadn't been I'd sort of picked up just as facts. I'd done the cheating before the exam version of understanding Krakoa. And now that the book is written, I am belatedly really reading all of the seminal Krakoa. I guess that's there's a very big, expensive trade paperback that's collected with all of those stories. And so I'm reading that now. And but I think as a general idea, I love the idea that at different stages of our lives, we end up having to learn often the same lesson, but in different ways and with different implications. So when I think about Krakoa, I think that it would be interesting to get a much more established rogue, a rogue who, is more at peace with herself, and then throw her off balance again in a different way. Because I think, we end up having, this is how I feel at this stage of my life, with kids who are the age I was, and still am in my mind. My kids are 22 and 25. And so sometimes I think I still feel that age. And at other times I feel, no, I'm dealing with very different issues. But, once again, you come up with your themes and your issues and yet it's the same, and yet it's different. And so that is my long-winded way of saying I think it'd be really interesting to revisit Rogue at a more mature turn of the wheel. So and the cat agrees, whoever's
So I don't know if anyone else has questions. Travis, maybe you want to say some of those of yours. I also have them.
Yeah, well, I know you have so many questions, so you go ahead. I've tried to keep quiet because I knew everybody had so many questions and we were on a tighter schedule. So I was like, I'm going to let people just talk. But yeah, if you have another question.
Yeah, of the things I have noted down, we also would love to know if your time at DC and Vertigo kind influenced how you write specifically superhero prose. I know that what you did there wasn't exactly superhero stuff for a lot of it, but some of it, yes. So that's it.
Sure. I mean, I think that I don't approach superhero. How can I think about it? I try to approach superhero stuff as people, as authentically as possible. And for simplicity's sake, I am just saying Rogue and Gambit. But when I write them, I wrote them mainly as, I think, Rogue was different. Usually I try to call superhero characters by their names. So Gambit is Remy, not Gambit. But this is a small spoiler, but she's Anna Marie. And a lot of people call her Marie, but she doesn't really feel like she's found herself at the beginning of the book. And in this book, I give an explanation for how she gets named Rogue. And she kind of claims that as, oh, this is who I am. And so that's why I am calling her Rogue. But I think that, in general, with, if I were writing Superman, he'd be Clark, because he is Clark. He doesn't go around thinking in his head, I'm Superman. And Batman doesn't think of himself as Batman. He's a little more, yes, okay. But you want to have as much of a sense of who a character is from the inside. And and that goes also to like, how do you write a large cast of characters? Every character I write has some element of me, because that's all I can do is sort of try to become that character when I'm writing them. And often I'll go back and look at a scene where, I've got Anna Nocenti's wonderful Spiral is also makes an appearance. And,
Yes.
I was nervous. I didn't speak to Anne until afterwards. And I know my take is a little different. But, I would take a scene and I would try and turn it around and think, okay, now I'm in Rita's point of view. And how does this look for me? Am I saying things that make sense from my point of view? If your antagonist in a scene is only doing something that serves the story, and is a foil for the hero, then it doesn't work. So you have to embody all the characters. And I guess that's, with Vertigo, it was that was sort of how I think everyone I was working with approached the characters. It was very real and very character-driven stories. And the strange was never just for the sake of being quirky or strange. It was deeply rooted in story and character.
I love that. I think it shines a lot in Rogue Untouched, and I'd like to see, if you have the opportunity to kind of pick any of these characters that you could do another novel on, is there any, without Marvel saying, no, you can't do this or you can't go here, if that's all free, who would you like to take on in another prose novel?
Oh my gosh. There are a lot. There are a lot of them that I would be interested in. Lucretia.
Yes.
I'd love to do something with Lucretia.
Yay!
But I also it was really fun to create my own mutant, and I would love to do something more with Tessa. I think she'd be such a fun character to explore.
Yes.
If I know prose novels, she'll probably not appear in a comic book next. But wouldn't that be lovely if another writer says, "Oh, actually, we could use a character like this, and look, we do have her." So that would make me
we got to start a campaign. We need a hashtag, some signatures. We can make it happen.
Don't bug me. Use Tessa.
Yes. No, it's right there. The campaign is there. We can make this happen.
we need comic book Tessa.
Say that again.
We need comic book Tessa. We absolutely need her. I think she was a great addition, and I would love to see her in Krakoa or wherever the XMen go next.
Yeah.
Thanks. I also I tend to have fun writing. How can I put this? So back in the 80s, there was all of this Dallas dynasty, sort of these grand dame middle-aged women with big sequined dresses, having pitched battles. And I love bringing some of that to my superhero writing. And so if the other character who shall remain nameless now, but I love the idea of, grand dame, very campy, older women superheroes. Yes, so that would be a whole other exercise. I nobody but me would probably want to read it, but that would be, just tremendous fun. Kind of you remember Death Becomes Her, where Meryl Streep and was it Goldie Hawn? They play two aging. Do you know the movie? I mean, they play two aging women who discover the secret to eternal life, and so they're sort of they're immortal but not indestructible. There was so much fun. So yes, I'd love to do the supervillain version of that.
Ooh, a new Marvel heroine novel just right there.
So I think we mostly covered everything. And well, thank you so much for coming and for people watching. And this was great. Like so much fun.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. This was really fun, and it just means a lot to be able to talk about the characters, and especially I feel, if I had any nervousness, it was that people who are dedicated X-Men fans, I wouldn't want to disappoint, any of them, any of you. And so to know that you enjoyed it, despite my vast pockets of ignorance, which I'm, my daughter is walking in. So just finishing up an interview. And anyway, so that I do not remember what I was saying.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute blast. And hopefully we can have you on again sometime soon to talk about some more Marvel characters or something else you're working on.
That'd be
I
great.
love. I mean, I don't know if you ever voyage sideways, but I am having so much fun doing this mini series for Ahoy, and I can't say anything too specific except that the artist is Alain Morissette. I'm supposed to say Alain Morissette. We've been friends for 5 years. I probably am still mispronouncing his name because it's French, but he's always been an amazing artist, but I can feel the level of fun on this is just off the charts, and I'm dying to be able to talk about it, and it's fun doing comics again too.
Yeah,
we would love to have you for that. Yes.
Like we had a full conversation just last week with Tom Payer at Ahoy on a Comic Watchers show. So we're glad to have you on anytime you want to help promote. We can make it happen.
Oh,
Totally.
thank you. Can I mention one other little project that I'm doing?
Yes.
Please.
I am starting, I think it's June 29th, a Sandman podcast with my friend Lonnie Diane Rich. She's a story expert. She's done shows on Outlander and Buffy. And I approached her and said I really wanted to do something on the Sandman in preparation for the Netflix TV series. So I'll be rereading. She'll be reading for the first time the Sandman issues that go into, that will be the foundation for the new series. And then we'll take a pause and we'll come back and we'll be talking about the TV series. And that's, I think we're called Endless. And it's through Chipperish Media, and it'll be on Anchor. And anyway, so that's the thing I'm doing too.
Yay! So that's great. That's so I lost myself there. So people who have watched or who are watching this in the future, the book comes out on Tuesday, May 4th, and pick it up. It's amazing. Like we loved it all. And
oh, thank you guys so much.
Thank you for coming.
For real.
All right.